December 20th, 1943. Somewhere over occupied Germany. Franz Stiegler's finger rested on the trigger as he closed in behind the shattered American bomber, and what he saw through those holes stopped him cold. He could see inside the aircraft, not through windows, through wounds. Hundreds of them, fist-sized punctures torn through aluminum skin, and through those holes he could see men, bleeding men, dying men, a tail gunner who no longer had a head. The Oberleutnant had shot down 2 B-17 that morning. One more heavy bomber kill would push him over the threshold for the Knight's Cross, one of Nazi Germany's highest decorations. His Bf-10-9 G6 was already damaged. A 50 caliber bullet lodged in the radiator from the earlier fights, but he'd ordered his ground crew to rearm anyway when this straggler appeared. Easy kill, helpless target. The defensive guns were silent. The tail section looked like it might fall off at any moment. 28 years old, 27 aerial victories. Veteran of Spain and North Africa. Franz Stiegler was about to become a decorated hero of the Reich. He did not pull the trigger. What Stiegler did next could have gotten him executed. What he did next would remain a secret for decades. But first, we have to go back to that morning. To the English airfield, where a 21-year-old farm boy from West Virginia woke up expecting to die. They called the B-17 the Flying Fortress. American propaganda loved that name. 10 defensive machine guns. Crews protected by the interlocking firepower of tight formations. The promise of precision daylight bombing that would surgically destroy Nazi industry while British bombers fumbled around in the dark. The British called it something else. Flying Coffin. They bombed at night because nighttime hid them from German fighters. The Americans flew in broad daylight because their generals believed you could hit a factory smokestack from 4 miles up if your bombardier had steady hands and clear weather. The Germans laughed at both names. Luftwaffe pilots called B-17 formations pulks, herds, and hunted them like wolves pursuing wounded cattle. By December 1943, the 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging crews so fast that replacement pilots arrived at English airbases expecting to die within 2 weeks. The statistics supported their pessimism. Second Lieutenant Charles Lester Brown climbed out of his bunk at RAF Kimballton in Cambridgeshire before dawn. Farm boy from Weston, West Virginia, 21 years old. Today would be his first combat mission as aircraft commander. His bomber was a Boeing B-17F Flying Fortress, serial number 423167, assigned to the 527th Bombardment Squadron of the 379th Bombardment Group. A previous crew had painted "Ye Olde Pub" on the nose, a joke about the English bars where airmen drank away their terror before missions. The target briefing froze the blood. Bremen, home to the Focke-Wulf factory that built the FW-190 fighters shredding Allied bomber formations across Europe. Intelligence officers warned of 250 anti-aircraft guns ringing the city. Hundreds of German fighters might intercept. The room went quiet. Crews exchanged the kind of glances that said goodbye, without words. Brown looked at his 10-man crew, kids mostly like him, and wondered how many would see Christmas. The temperature at 27,300 feet was negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh in seconds, cold enough to turn the morphine in their first aid kits into useless chunks of ice. The electrically heated flight suits kept them alive, barely, as long as the wiring didn't short out. The oxygen masks iced over with every exhalation. The machine gun lubricants turned to sludge. Everything in the sky wanted to kill them before the Germans even got a chance. The flak found Ye Olde Pub before the bombs dropped. An anti-aircraft shell detonated near the nose. The plexiglass cone shattered. Rushing wind at 60 below zero filled the forward compartment. The navigator and bombardier screamed into the slipstream as ice formed on their eyelids. Engine number 2 coughed and died. Engine number 4 took shrapnel and began running rough. Brown fought the controls. The bomber slid out of formation, airspeed dropping, altitude falling. The protective box of other B-17s pulled ahead, leaving Ye Olde Pub alone in the sky, a straggler. The worst thing a bomber could become. The Luftwaffe pilots of Jagdgeschwader 11 descended like sharks, scenting blood. A dozen Bf-109s and FW-190s made attack run after attack run. 10 minutes of hell. The bombers' defensive guns, those 1050 caliber machine guns that justified the Flying Fortress name, were systematically destroyed. Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, the tail gunner, died when a 20mm cannon shell struck his position. The explosion decapitated him. Large sections of the tail structure vanished in the blast. The kid from Pennsylvania would never know he was 23 years old for the last time. Brown took shrapnel to the right shoulder. He stayed at the controls. Sergeant Alex Russian, Yelesanko, caught shrapnel in the leg at his waist gun position. Sergeant Richard Petchute, the radio operator, took a shell fragment in the eye. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Samuel Blackford, suffered severe frostbite to both feet when his heated suit shorted out. The morphine that might have helped was frozen solid. Men screamed or prayed or simply endured. Then Charlie Brown lost consciousness. The wounded pilot slumped forward. Ye Olde Pub entered an uncontrolled descent, plunging toward German farmland in a screaming spiral. The altimeter unwound toward zero. Wounded crewmen were pinned by G-forces, watching their world spin toward collision. Somewhere in that death spiral, hundreds of feet above stone farmhouses and frozen fields, Brown woke up. He grabbed the control column, hauled back with everything he had, pulled the disintegrating bomber level mere hundreds of feet above the German countryside. 3 of 4 engines were damaged or destroyed. Engine number 3 produced half power. Total thrust sat at 40% of rated capacity, barely enough to maintain flight. The Flying Fortress that American generals promised would conquer German airspace was now a shattered wreck held together by aluminum threads and desperation. And Franz Stigler was climbing to intercept. He approached from behind and below. Classic attack position. The defensive tail guns were destroyed. The gunner was obviously dead. The other turrets appeared silent. Stigler lined up his gun sight. Easy kill. 1 trigger pull for the Knight's Cross. He closed the distance, and then he saw what he was about to shoot. Through the hundreds of holes torn in the fuselage, Stigler could see inside the aircraft. Wounded men slumped at their stations, blood on the deck plates. The decapitated tail gunner visible through the wreckage of his position. The nose completely gone. Control surfaces hanging in ribbons. Men not shooting back because they couldn't. Men dying because the plane was dying. Stigler heard a voice. Not through his radio, through his memory. Gustav Rödel, his old commanding officer from the North Africa days, a man who believed there was still honor in war. If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself. Stigler studied the crippled bomber, the men inside who had no way to defend themselves, the aircraft that should have fallen from the sky 10 times over, but somehow hadn't. To me, he would say later, it was just like they were in a parachute. I saw them and I couldn't shoot them down. He did not pull the trigger. What Stigler did next violated every regulation, every expectation, every instinct of self-preservation a German officer should have possessed. He flew forward, not away, forward. He pulled his Bf-109 alongside the crippled B-17 and began making hand signals through the cockpit canopy. Charlie Brown, bleeding from his shoulder wound, barely conscious from oxygen deprivation, looked out his port window and saw an enemy fighter flying in formation 3 feet from his wingtip. The German pilot was not firing. He was pointing, down toward German territory, then north towards Sweden. Stigler was trying to save them. Land in Germany, his gestures said. Medical treatment for the wounded. Prisoner of war camp, not death. Or fly north to Sweden, neutral territory, internment, survival. The language barrier made translation impossible. Brown's oxygen-starved brain couldn't process what was happening. A German fighter, flying peacefully, after everything his crew had just endured. Brown kept flying west, toward England, toward home. Stigler made a decision that could have killed him. Instead of breaking off, instead of reporting the encounter and collecting his Knight's Cross points, he flew his Bf-109 to the port side of Ye Old Pub and stayed there, position deliberate. German anti-aircraft gunners on the ground would see his silhouette. They would hold fire rather than risk hitting their own fighter. He was using his own aircraft as a shield for an enemy bomber. The strange formation limped across occupied Europe. Flak batteries that should have finished off the helpless B-17 remained silent. They saw the German fighter. They hesitated. They did nothing. Mile after mile, Stigler escorted the men he was supposed to kill. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the crew watched in disbelief. The dorsal turret swung its twin 50 caliber machine guns towards Stigler's fighter. Brown ordered hold fire. They didn't understand what was happening. They couldn't understand, but they knew that shooting this particular German would be murder, not combat. The formation reached the North Sea coast. German-controlled airspace ended. The grey expanse of freezing water stretched toward England, 250 miles away. Here, at the limit of the Reich's reach, Stigler pulled alongside Brown's cockpit one final time. Two men saw each other's faces through the glass. 21 and 28, American and German. The killed and the killer who chose not to kill. Stigler raised his hand. Formal military salute. Brown returned it. Stigler banked away, turned back toward Germany, left the shattered B-17 to make its own way across the North Sea. Ye Old Pub was alone again. Engine number 2 was dead. Engine number 4 was failing. Engine number 3 ran at half power. The control surfaces required constant muscular effort from both pilots to maintain anything resembling level flight. The wounded were slipping in and out of consciousness. The dead tail gunner remained at his destroyed position. Brown aimed the dying bomber toward England and held his course. The flying Coffin refused to become a coffin. The plane they called a coffin. The German ace who could have claimed a medal. The American lieutenant who just wanted to bring his boys home. The mocked savior delivered.